Rendering a component. Hey everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, we're going to take a look at how we can expand our understanding of using React.js to include components. Components are going to be the powerful, flexible objects that we actually use to power our React.js applications. They're very, very important to understand. They're going to drive everything else that we learn inside of this series. React.js components, or the React component object that we're going to talk about, is really the jet engine of our React.js application. This is the thing that's going to make it all work. We're going to take advantage of using JavaScript to render our DOM as opposed to just a straight HTML file. And the reason for that, the reason that this is going to become so important, is we have to understand that a React element object isn't all that especially useful to us, at least not all by itself. So a React element object is the object that's rendered inside of the React DOM.render function. And you can see that in a previous nugget, rendering a React element, that yeah, you can very easily create HTML elements inside of your JavaScript code, but that falls apart pretty quickly. Imagine a scenario where you need a slightly more complex DOM. And hey, let's face it, we're building cool, interactive, dynamic applications. We're going to have complicated DOMs. Well, if we want to stick all of this JSX right inside of the React DOM.render function, that's not really ideal. That's not going to do much good for us. It's not reusable. We have no way to attach user interaction to that code. We're basically just cut and pasted HTML into our JavaScript file, and well, that doesn't do us any good. We're going to have one big React DOM.render function that's going to be 600 lines long because it's got all of our HTML code in it. We haven't really taken advantage of any of the features of React. And the same thing is true even if we move that JSX up into an element, or up into an object, let's call it var ele, and then we re-enter that ele object. Yeah, now it's a little bit more reusable, but basically we still have the same issue in that we haven't done anything to take advantage of JavaScript. We're not taking advantage of React.js. So enter the React component object, and there's really two objects that we're talking about here, React component and React element. I'm going to cover those more in depth in another nugget. But just so you understand, React element is the object that's passed into the React DOM.render function, and it's really good for simple HTML elements. You can do H1s or Ps or whatever HTML elements you need, you can do with a simple React element. But it's not good for the complex sorts of things that we want to do. That's where a React component comes in. It's going to create reusable components that notably have event handlers and property management, property bags, for creating state inside of our application. And this is really important. React components return a React element in their own little render method. So again, I'll cover this more in depth in a different nugget, but React elements are really contained or encapsulated by React components. This allows us to create something like this little code sample here. I'm going to bring this up live in a minute so we can go through it. Here I've created a component which has as part of it, yes, that HTML script, but that component gets used down here in the render element in this JSX in a nice reusable fashion. We'll be able to break it out into its own JavaScript file if we want. We'll be able to attach event handlers and property bags to it. So it's really going to enable a lot of powerful features for us. So here is my custom fiddle for creating a simple React component. You can check it out at this URL right here. I encourage you to do that and play along yourself here while I go through this. Now the code itself is pretty straightforward. Let's break it down where you can first of all draw a line right here. Everything below this line is our rendering function, React DOM.render. And you can see that all we do is we render a simple element called myComponent. And well, that should be interesting to you. That's not valid HTML. There is no such HTML element called myComponent. It simply doesn't exist. I've created it, I've defined it up here in this variable with the React.createClass function. So JSX is very powerful this way. It's intelligent enough to interpret my component as my custom component and render it appropriately. Now, one important thing to note here is that my component begins with a capital M. And that is an indicator for JSX that this should be rendered as a custom React.js component and not just a straight text into the browser. Check this out. If I come here and I change that to a lowercase m, even if I change it to a lowercase m in both places, and I try to run this, you can see on the right hand side that it didn't work. Nothing came out. Because what happened here is it rendered literally my component with a little m into the browser. The browser doesn't know what to do with that, so it just spit it out into the file. It didn't produce anything. So the capital letter at the beginning of this this object name is very important for JSX so that it knows what it's doing. It knows how to translate this component into valid HTML. Hopefully you're already beginning to see some of the value in using this component method. For starters, well, I called it my component. That's not especially descriptive, but say it had been a cool calendar control. I could have called it my calendar, and then anyone who looked at this render function, regardless of whether or not it was in the same file as the component definition, could say, oh, my calendar, that's probably a calendar control. I could use it over and over inside the render function without duplicating the dozens or even hundreds of lines of code that it might take to make that work, and it wouldn't take up any additional code other than my calendar. Plus, I could actually put my component up here inside of this chunk of JSX right here. So I can reuse it inside of other components. Awesome reusability, compact, isolated code. These are things that we love as developers, and it helps turn our HTML into a more declarative user interface as opposed to an imperative one, which is really important for developing clean user interface code. And one of the things that makes React.js so powerful when it comes to unidirectional data flow, state management, etc. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's start by talking about this create class function, understand exactly what I've done here. So create class is part of the React library, and again in another nugget I'm going to talk about React versus React DOM. But the create class function, you can see, actually only takes a single parameter. That's the specification object. See this little curly brace here and here? I'm passing in one object, one parameter, to create class. It's called the specification object. And the specification object for React components is where all the magic happens. But you don't have to use all that magic initially. You only need one thing inside of that specification object, one property of that object called render. Render is a function that, yes, as you might guess, tells JSX how to render this component inside of HTML. It tells us how to turn this component into valid HTML. And all that the render function does is returns a React element object. Remember, we talked off the top of this nugget about React elements versus React components, and I was like, well, React elements stink. We don't want to use them. Well, I lied. We actually use them all the time because they are ultimately the output of our React component. And that way down here in our render function, it can get a React element object to pass into React DOM.render, because remember, React DOM.render takes an element. It doesn't take a component, it takes an element. So the render function here, the only member of our specification object that gets passed into our class, simply returns, well, in this case, a whole bunch of HTML. That HTML ultimately gets rendered down in our render function, and ta-da! We get a nice paragraph written out here inside of our HTML. At this point, with nothing more than the React DOM.render function and the React.create class function, we've got some really powerful JavaScript tools under our belt for producing user interfaces. There's a whole lot more that we have to learn about effectively using React, but we've really got the base here. This is going to be what makes up the entire rest of this series of nuggets, is understanding how we can create powerful functional components and then render those components into our HTML documents appropriately. Now I talked about that object specification object, and I'm going to go into it a little bit more, but this is a link to the documentation for that specification object. And you can see the very first thing that it mentions here is the render function, which returns a React element object. You can check out this documentation and read up on the specification object. It's really important to understand because, again, this is where all of the meat and potatoes of our React applications is going to happen. So that concludes this nugget on rendering a component inside of React.js. To recap, React components are the complex objects that include our state management for our React application. What does that mean? Well, it means that ultimately our React application is going to be built from components. They are the baseline object that we use in order to produce elements that React can then turn into our DOM to be rendered into the document. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.